At the NATO summit in Lithuania, member nations have agreed to let Ukraine join the alliance and to fast-track the process, but they fell short of an official invitation or any clear timeline for membership. The CBC's Evan Dyer is there.
David, we're in a part of the world where signs of public support for Ukraine are everywhere, but that didn't translate into the support Volodymyr Zelensky was hoping for from NATO today.
Slava Ukraini!
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's rally in Vilnius showcased his support from the crowds outside the NATO summit. But inside, Ukraine's effort to join NATO got a cooler reception.
We also made clear that we will issue an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO when allies agree and conditions are met.
The Ukrainian leader responded with an angry tweet. For Russia, this means motivation to continue its terror. Uncertainty is weakness. NATO members have made it clear that Ukraine can't join while it's involved in an active war, because that would immediately bring all NATO members into direct conflict with Russia. But Ukraine was still hoping for more. Sweden, however, got a pleasant surprise from Turkey, the country that had been standing in the way of its ambition to become member number 32. Turkey's Recep Erdogan agreed to drop his veto in return for concessions from Sweden that include the lifting of a ban on arms sales. Sweden and Finland's accession to the alliance turned the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, a major blow to Russia's Baltic fleet. But controversy continued on another front, Washington's decision to give Ukraine cluster munitions, some of which failed to explode. Canada is against it.
Of course, we do not agree with the American position. We believe in our international obligations when it comes to cluster munitions.
Canada supported the effort behind a treaty banning cluster munitions that includes penalties against countries that use them. Ukraine's defense minister pointed out that Russia has been using them since the start of the war and promised they'd only be used on Ukraine's own territory, away from built-up areas. And there was no talk from allies of penalties.
We'll continue to provide strong military assistance.
So, David, any opposition to that transfer of cluster munitions to Ukraine will likely remain at the level of rhetoric. It's very clear that the priority of the nations gathered here is that Ukraine win the war against Russia, whatever it takes. David.
That's the CBC's Evan Dyer traveling with the Prime Minister. So clearly no membership for Ukraine until NATO's conditions are met, and this obviously being interpreted as meaning after the war is over. Rose Gottemoeller is a former NATO Deputy Secretary General and is now a lecturer at Stanford University. Ms. Gottemoeller, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg today is laying out a simpler path to membership for Ukraine, but no clear timeline for full membership. Is this enough?
I think it's a remarkable achievement what NATO has done for Ukraine. It's also a remarkable achievement what Ukraine has done for itself, frankly, in terms of turning itself into a modern armed forces with real interoperability with NATO and really going pretty down far the path of foreign and security policy reform. That's going to be super important to the NATO alliance, as was picked out in the NATO communique. Ukraine still has some work to do, but they are clearly on, I would say, a smooth path to NATO membership now.
But how does today, what was said today, substantially change things for Ukraine? Because it's still when the allies agree and when conditions are met. And we've seen some frustration from Volodymyr Zelensky over this.
Well, honestly, it's a big change because before, at every NATO summit when I was Deputy Secretary General from 2016 to 2019, the Ukrainians were asking time and time again for a membership action plan as a clear signal that they were ready for NATO membership and could start the path of NATO membership. But at this point, the allies are saying, you don't need a membership action plan anymore. You have become substantially interoperable. You are well on the path of reform now. And so we are setting that aside. It's exactly the same thing they said to Sweden and Finland. So to my mind, putting Ukraine together with Sweden and Finland is a really kind of remarkable step in terms of the membership action plan. It's a smooth path to NATO membership. Now, clearly they have some more work to do, and one of the issues raised once again at the summit was a continuation of foreign and security reform, and that will deal with corruption. Tackling corruption, I think, is going to be priority number one for Ukraine as far as the NATO allies are concerned, but also, by the way, as far as the European Union is concerned.
Right. No, of course. But getting rid of the membership action plan, essentially it's a one-step process now instead of a two-step process. But like you mentioned Sweden and Finland. So in the time since Russia has invaded, NATO has expanded or is about to expand to include the two of them. But they still haven't given Kyiv a firm timeline. And can you understand President Zelensky's frustration here when he gets annoyed that he can't get a date?
I think that President Biden was very clear that as long as Ukraine is at war with Russia, extending NATO membership to Ukraine would mean that essentially NATO would have Article 5 commitments and would need to come to the defense of Ukraine. And this would mean a general war in Europe and perhaps World War III. And President Biden's been very clear about that from the outset, that risking World War III is not something that the NATO allies are ready to do, nor should it be in the interest of the global community at all to risk World War III. So that's been, I think, a pretty firm position. That said, I really believe that there is a much different commitment now to Ukraine than there was at the start of this Russian aggression. That has to do with the clear, I would say, pathway to Ukraine's membership of NATO, but also the huge amount of security assistance, which was once again, I think, underscored at the summit meeting with some very new pledges.
Right. You speak of those new pledges and you talk about the security assistance, and Secretary General Stoltenberg reiterated today that he expects a number of countries spending 2% of GDP on defense to substantially rise next year. What, in your view, is the importance of that when you look at the volatile security environment we're seeing today?
It symbolizes more than anything that the allies agree that they can no longer free ride on the defense expenditures of the United States. For many, many decades, the allies really depended on the United States for important what are called enablers like lift capability, the ability to refuel aircraft, and furthermore, the ability to reinforce Europe, to move large numbers of troops from North America, from Canada and the United States to Europe. So I think recognizing that the United States can't do it all anymore was what the 2% of GDP pledge was all about back in 2014 when the Russians first invaded Crimea. So finally, seeing the allies willing to step up and fulfill those commitments, that is an important message once again, that they are shouldering the defense burden, and the United States does not need to do it all.
Well, what if we come out of this this gathering with the 2% becoming a floor as opposed to a target, as Jens Stoltenberg is hoping, and a lot of countries, including this one, which are a fair bit below this? I mean, what message would it send to the Americans if the NATO allies who have the wealth and the means to do this still don't get to the 2%?
Well, I will only repeat what I've said time and time and time again, and that is all NATO allies benefit from the security that the NATO alliance extends to them, and that goes for Canada. It goes for every single member of the alliance, from Norway in the north to Albania in the south. And so I think all NATO allies have the responsibility to put their money where their mouth is, and really stand up to the pledges that they have made and really committed to now almost 10 years ago, but reiterated once again at the summit meeting. Now, certain countries, such as Canada, clearly have great capability and capacity for providing additional security in the Arctic regions. And so I think allies that have special capabilities and capacities can bring those to bear in a very effective way, and that is helpful in fulfilling the 2% of GDP.
Rose Gottemoeller, former NATO Deputy Secretary General, thank you so much for your time today.
You are welcome.
And as we were just discussing, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is outraged over the lack of clarity on a timeline for Ukraine's NATO membership, calling it unprecedented and absurd. He says Ukraine will actually make NATO stronger. For more on this story, I'm joined by former Canadian ambassador to Ukraine, Roman Waschuk. Mr. Waschuk is now Ukraine's business ombudsman. Mr. Waschuk, it's good to speak with you again.
Lovely to be with you.
I'd like to start with the whole question of NATO membership for Ukraine, because the leaders reaffirmed today that Ukraine's future is in NATO, but only when allies agree certain conditions are met. What's your reaction to this news?
As a communique, it's kind of a limp noodle, frankly. And President Zelensky, not terribly happy, was tweeting about it as he flew to Vilnius. But I think his mood improved once he got on the ground, and I think he's going to use tomorrow's meeting of the first NATO-Ukraine Council to try and see if he can firm up the noodle.
Okay, that's an interesting noodle analogy there. I would like Zelensky, though, is pretty mad about it, blasting it, saying it's unprecedented and absurd that NATO is not clarifying the timelines. Well, what do you make of that language and that reaction specifically?
When your country's soldiers, men and women, are dying by the hundreds and ultimately by the thousands, and you get text that sort of says, well, we're not sure if these guys really meet standards. We'll have to do, some box ticking here and some consultations there. It's almost worse than being afraid of letting them in or saying we have security concerns. It's phrased in a kind of technocratically condescending kind of way, which I think makes it smart even more. But I think everyone kind of needs to get over that and look at the more practical stuff that's out there. The French came up with a big announcement on long-range missiles, the Germans with nearly $1 billion in additional equipment, and this 11-country F-16 coalition, which includes Canada. So I think once people get over the wording issues, maybe they'll focus on the practicalities.
There was the dropping of the requirement for a membership action plan, which we've just spoken to Rose Gottemoller, who says that is a positive indication of how NATO views Ukraine. But I guess you can't really give a specific date for membership when you don't know when the fighting is going to be over, right? I mean, that is the number one challenge here, is it not?
Yes, it is. But I think what the Ukrainians would have liked to see is what the Americans seem to be keen to keep out of the picture, which is a kind of automaticity. In other words, once the fighting ends, you're kind of in. In the same way that Finland was accepted and Sweden without all the box ticking and the assurances that every condition is right, etc. So yeah, people used to talk about Finlandization as a problematic concept. I think the Ukrainians would be happy to be Finlandized right now.
I want to switch, if I can, to just another big topic on the agenda, and that is the defense spending, because the allies are expected to agree that 2% of GDP is the floor for spending and not just the ceiling target. Canada, nowhere near that target, no plan to get there. Does that remain a tenable position given the activity surrounding NATO and the volatile security environment right now?
I think Canada will need to do more. Canada's already promised to practically do more, i.e. by more than doubling its presence in Latvia, and that means it'll need to redeploy the Canadian forces. It means they'll need to beef them up. We have been, to a considerable extent, free riders in security terms, and I think the free ride is pretty much over. That means huge things for Canada, because it means we need to increase recruitment. We need to overhaul our extremely complicated and error-prone procurement systems. So even if Canada wanted to spend 2%, it couldn't right now. It hasn't got the people to spend it on, and it hasn't got the equipment purchases in place to be able to spend that money, to disperse it. So it will require a pretty much whole of government effort to move towards the 2% as a major challenge.
I wonder if I could just touch on one more topic with you, and this is the controversial issue of the United States sending cluster munitions to Ukraine, a type of weapon that Canada and 123 other nations sort of pledged to prohibit back in 2008. It's a controversial move. I mean, from your perspective, should Canada be speaking out more loudly against this, or just accept this as a necessity because of the state of the conflict raging in Ukraine?
Right. Well, I worked on advocacy for the Ottawa Convention on Landmines, and certainly also that on promoting Canada's position on signing the Oslo Treaty on cluster munitions. But when we were doing all of that, the assumption was that we would never again be facing a large-scale industrial land war anywhere, much less in Europe. The idea was the users would be fragile states, rogue states, or else it might be us or people like us in an expeditionary situation like Iraq or Afghanistan, where you wouldn't want to have civilians, leave behind these weapons to have them hurt civilians. So frankly, I think in the current situation where the Russians have long been using cluster weapons and the Ukrainians have a need to counter the trenches that the Russians have built, that indeed these weapons are actually being used for the narrow purpose for which they were initially developed, and not for the sort of not abused in ways that the convention was intended to stop. So I frankly don't think we need to ramp up the criticism. Countries that were very slow in providing other forms of weapons that Ukrainians would need to advance, especially airplanes, should not now have huge pangs of guilt about weapons that might have been used had someone tried to attack us. Frankly, Canada's ratification of the Cluster Munitions Agreement includes caveats that allow Canadian officers and Canadian soldiers to deploy them and use these weapons if they're embedded with someone else, i.e. the US. So we are not as completely lily-white in our approach to this as some may think.